It's great to have you listening here on Old News, but here's a taste of what else is available on your podcast app.
Welcome to Mind Master. Let's ask our first contender to join us in the chair. And your name is? Bob Bobbins. Your occupation? Manatee Wrangler. And your specialist subject? The Last Tuesday Project. In 2 minutes, or however long this trailer lasts, starting now, what is The Last Tuesday Project? A podcast? Correct. When does it come out?
Tuesdays?
Yes. How does it work? One person asks a question or comes up with a topic, and the others have an hour to research the subject. They all get back together and discuss the topic. Correct. Who's on it? Alex, Haley, Sean, and a frankly baffling cast of former and guest Tuesdays. Correct. What is a Dimbleby? The person who asks the question. Right. Does anyone have an unfair advantage? Not anymore, because that running gag died after the first 4 episodes. Correct. Where can you listen to it? iTunes, Pocket Casts, TuneIn, Stitcher, or your favourite podcasting app? Correct. Am I doing an impersonation of John? I've started, so I'll finish. Humphreys? No, because you're awful at impressions, so this has just been you talking to yourself for 2 minutes or so. And after that round, I have no idea how many you scored because I couldn't be bothered to count. But everyone should listen to The Last Tuesday Project because, well, you know, information and stuff. Hello, this is Old News. My name's David.
And I'm Russell, and it's good to be back. How are you?
I'm alright again. Yeah.
I am very impressed with the standard of production on the trailer for our friends at The Last Tuesday Project.
Really?
Yeah. Well, what I find hysterical about the whole thing is that we've got much higher production values for promoting somebody else's podcast
we have for our own.
than we have for our own. But in fairness, you know, I think that might be true on both sides of the equation here, because I've been very impressed by the standard of work coming out of them. One thing I'd like to sort of go over and commend the Last Tuesday Project for, because we're talking about them, is their last episode surrounding mental health issues. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed that, and I thought how fantastic to hear a very candid,
yes,
and very personal discussion without kind of fear of mockery or whatever. Very important issues, and you know, I mean, we're both people who mental health issues have touched our lives, and you know, I think that's to be applauded. So well done them.
Old News.
In what is good news for old news, we've hit double figures.
Yeah, this is episode 10.
Who'd have thought we'd get this far?
Yeah. What? How many months are we in now? November, December, January, February, March, April, May. 7 months in, we've hit episode 10.
So we're averaging more than once a month as well, which is excellent.
Yeah, we were trying to do 2 a month, but
well, yeah, I'm really quite pleased, and our sort of listenership is gradually increasing, you know, for various episodes. So,
we had a really. I don't know if you look at the. Actually, I know you don't really look at the stats. We had a bizarre jump in listeners, I think 3 or 4 days ago, all from Mexico.
From Mexico? Interesting.
Yeah.
Welcome to our Mexican listeners. Yeah.
Yeah.
Glad to have you on board. Please do get in touch.
Old News.
What else is new?
What else is new?
I've developed I've had strong opinions on nail brushes for a long time, but it came to a head today. Because I do a bit of a dirty job in my professional life. I have spent the majority of this week trying to get my hands clean from the just terrible grime that I endured in the last period of work that I did. And can I find a proper scrubbing brush with stiff bristles to clean my hands with?
Right.
All nail brushes that I can find are inadequate. The 2 I had in the house were inadequate. I went to all the shops, and I eventually ended up in a shop, Lakeland, who sell cooking stuff. Yeah. And do you sell nail brushes? No, we don't. But she said, but we do have a vegetable scrubber, and this thing in the shape of a carrot. But it has stiff bristles. It's like, I'm having that. So I now have a carrot scrubber in my bathroom.
You have a thing in the shape of a carrot in your bath.
Oh, dude, this is so frustrating. It's like, what about... See, this is a classic case of where consumer products are just designed with one audience in mind, and it's designed for your kind of everyday office worker who gets a bit of grime on their hands and they just need to wash, right? The rest of us who need something to actually scrub with, it's so frustrating. Anyway, I've also bought a proper scrubbing brush from an industrial supplier, so I had to spend 10 minutes registering on the internet to order this damn thing. And I just want to clean my hands. An
industrial scrubbing brush?
Well, there is a particular type of... You see, I have strong opinions on this. There's a particular type of nail brush you find in places which it's like has a wooden handle on it and very stiff bristles. And it is a nail brush, but you just don't see them outside of industrial settings. And could I find them anywhere in the shops? No. So here I am looking on the internet at an industrial supplier. So I've had to buy 5 of them, but that's so annoying. Really frustrating. You
know what I've just realised? We haven't got the beer of indeterminate strength.
Oh, should we get some beer of indeterminate strength?
Yes. We'll be right back.
He's an interlude. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, we're back.
Yeah, with I have the
fit beer.
Yeah, the white beer with the indeterminate strength. And
yes.
Which do you have?
I've got it's a very standard English bitter.
How is it?
I haven't tried it yet. No, it's not bad.
It's wet.
Tasty. No, it's not bad.
Mine is nice too.
It's old news.
So I think today's discussion could lead into some sort of interesting and potentially quite controversial areas, maybe. The format of old news is, how did we describe it?
Two blokes chatting.
Two blokes chatting, isn't it? Yeah. Which I think, isn't that a line from Hello Internet? I think, which is another fine podcast, but they don't promote us, so I don't suppose we should promote them yet. Oh God, imagine if they did. Responsibility. Yeah, but just remind people that we are just sort of two blokes in the north of England with no formal journalistic training.
Yeah.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's right. No journalistic training. We're not historians or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think unavoidably tonight's subject might touch on some subjects which both of us are white guys, and we might touch on the subject of race. So, if we make a mistake, if we tread on a toe in a way that we don't understand, let us know. I mean, I'm very happy to be corrected and, feedback. What do you think needed to be said?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What we're going to be talking about tonight is New Orleans and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. To the Americans who might be listening, would like to remind you that we are several thousand miles away, and we've used the internet to research this, and we're coming at it from our point of view.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that, there was a lot of things that I personally didn't understand and have learnt about while investigating this, down to something we'll talk about in a very few minutes. Just the meaning of some words that Americans use an awful lot,
and to be honest, quite commonplace.
Yeah, and to be honest, our media used while it was going on without ever really explaining what they meant. Yeah. And a lot of British people don't know what they are, what they mean.
Baffled by it.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because we'll probably talk a little bit about news coverage along the way, which sort of tends to be a bit of a theme on old news.
Well, kind of is the point.
Surprisingly, right? But I think it is interesting that we often get blanket coverage of things from English-speaking nations. Obviously, and this is a major event. I mean, let's not downplay that. This is a hugely significant event. It's interesting how I think our news media is very comfortable just sort of repeating verbatim things from the States and thinks their audience gets it.
Yeah,
and I don't think I think often we don't. We don't understand some of the terminology, and we don't understand like the nuance or the background of like the history of things. We just get the sort of garish flash of, this thing has happened and we're going to blanket cover it because it's in English and therefore it's quite easy to do, but we get very little context. Yeah.
Well, one thing I've had people say to me in the past, nothing to do with old news, from well before we started doing anything like this, is that they wished the news would give background on stories. Well, of course, the news, an actual news programme, can't do that because they haven't got time. But it is a legitimate complaint, I think, that people are left behind by not knowing the background of.
And I suppose, in a way, that kind of is one of the things that motivates us doing old news, isn't it? That's kind of one of the original ideas behind the format was, maybe at a bit of distance you would have time to sort of think about such things.
Old news.
Tonight's topic of discussion I've called simply Hurricane Katrina, and obviously the main focus tonight will probably be the effects on Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. Yeah. I think one of the things it's worth touching on just before we start is that Hurricane Katrina makes landfall twice because it passes over Florida first. Is it just like a very severe tropical depression, I think, as it goes over there? Or it might be just, say, hurricane status. It sort of dwindles, but then as it goes over the Gulf of Mexico, it really, really picks up strength and it gets up to a Category 3 or even Category 5 at one point, and then it descends back down to a Category 3, which my notes here, I think, like peak winds of 125 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I just find baffling.
I can't even imagine. Yeah.
I mean, we both lived through the Great Storm of 1987 here in the UK,
where the winds hit 70 miles an hour. 74 miles.
Yeah. Although I'm led to believe there was one night at work where we touched winds up to about 85 miles an hour.
Oh, right.
Yeah, which was really, really severe. But yeah, it just baffles me what that must be like. All those populations in the Caribbean, the southeastern part of the US, Mexico, and so on, they're, I wouldn't say used to it, but they know what to expect.
Yeah, parts of the world, all around the world.
Well, I guess because we talk about hurricanes, but also the typhoons in the south, the sort of southern Pacific. Yeah. I think we're so lucky, aren't we? Here in a relatively temperate part of the world.
Yeah.
Oldeth, newseth.
Let's do the two words, the specific two words.
Right, let's do the glossary.
Our little glossary.
Yeah.
So there's two words that I have heard all my life, mainly in songs, but really came up in this, and that is levee and bayou. No idea what they were until I vaguely knew that a levee was something to do with keeping water back.
Right.
But it's a wall, either natural or man-made, used for blocking water, changing the route of water.
So that could potentially be any types of water, so things like rivers and canals and
swamps, marshes, coastal water. Yeah. And a bayou is a flat, low-lying body of water. And it seems to be a very broad term.
Right. So bayou, I think in a lot of people's imaginations, just means swamp, but it could be other things.
It can be other things, up to a very slow-moving stream, apparently.
Right, okay.
But I think in terms of New Orleans, we're probably looking at swamps, marshes.
Yeah, and presumably you get sort of very broad, very shallow rivers that run through swamps very slowly.
Yeah.
And I imagine a large part of the geography around there is that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose those sorts of lands, swampy, marshy lands and coastal lands, tend to be poor areas.
Yeah. Although New Orleans itself, historically, was quite a rich city.
Right, because it's a big port facility, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a big point for import-export into the States and also oil and gas.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah.
I mean, after the Civil War, it's been more or less a constant decline, but a constant decline from being one of the richest cities in the South, if not the richest city in the South.
Right. Now, I suppose, is that historically connected to it being the capital of French America?
Yeah.
So it was a
it was very
city.
well placed as a port city. It was the third biggest port in the United States, or North America, if you want to say that. Third biggest port in North America, as I say, up until the Civil War.
You looked a little bit into some of the geography of the city and sort of what happens in the years running up to the event. So it's always been a city prone to flooding
because of where it is.
Because it's so low, it's very low-lying land.
Low-lying, right next to the Mississippi River. It became more prone to flooding in the early 20th century because as the city grew, what they started doing was pumping water out from the swamps and marshes and building on it.
Right.
Which is always a bad move, really, when you're talking about flooding.
In some ways, how much of that reflects what was going on elsewhere in the States? Like the classic is the Mississippi River, in the 20s and the 30s, where largely as public works projects, up into the 50s and 60s, they cut across the meanders.
Right, yeah.
To straighten the river, to reclaim land for agricultural use or development or whatever. So it kind of fits in with that pattern.
That sort of low-lying effect was exacerbated by the fact that these areas started subsiding, making them drop down to a good few feet below sea level.
Right. Well, I suppose this is the sponge effect, right? If you take the water out, the soil, the land will just gradually sink naturally, right?
Yeah. In the 80s and 90s, so 1980, 1990, not 18, it was realised that erosion, sort of natural erosion of the riverbanks and the natural levees and so on, was making the city more prone to flooding, more at risk of storm surges.
Right, and in storm surges, what happens, I suppose define our terms a little bit, is when you have a very rapid increase in the sea level caused by a storm, presumably because of the low air pressures and the wind pushing.
So the city was at risk of this happening.
Yeah, and you wonder whether that increased risk, as erosion starts to take hold and the defences become weaker. You wonder if that is really just a process of nature naturally trying to claim back what had been held back in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
It has that feel about it, because ultimately that's what happened to the Mississippi River. All of those channels they built to straighten the river silted up.
Right.
In the 60s and 70s, and very, very quickly a lot of the meanders were reclaimed by the river, because when those things happened they tended to be quite dramatic, because it would suddenly overtop where it had sort of being blocked off, and quickly the river would have its way, and
cause chaos. Yeah,
and you wonder if this is like kind of a similar process at work. So one of the things I find strange about this is the building of levees, which is to say dikes and the walls on tops of dikes, to hold water back, is all controlled in the States by the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah, that's something I thought was strange.
It's a totally, I've come across them before in reading different things, so that they have all sorts of responsibilities in the States, but it's a very peculiar, I think it's unique to the States, isn't it? The military has this sort of arm. And yet, by what I can tell, a lot of the people in the Army Corps of Engineers are essentially civilian engineers and things that they move into it, and they do wear uniform and they carry rank, but it's operated as like semi.
I didn't look into that. I just picked up on it being a bit strange. You get, from our point of view as British people, surely you'd have a civilian organisation for doing that.
Well, that's in the UK we used to have things like the Ministry of Works. We, and we have nowadays this sort of work is done by the Environmental Protection Agency and so on. They're all civilian arms of government. It's very peculiar. But the American government does seem to be a bit like that. Like for a long time, the Secret Service were a branch of the Treasury.
Oh yeah.
They're no longer, apparently.
Are they not?
Just recently, a few years ago, they were moved. But these sort of artifacts of some political manoeuvre many years ago, and they retain this sort of historical status. Very peculiar. But one of the little snippets I picked up on this, in the floods there was 55 individual breaches of the levees, and there was a report done afterwards where the Army Corps of Engineers had to essentially atone for its sins. They had built and reinvested a lot of money into the levees in the 80s, and this was all on the basis of a report into the specifications that were needed. And so apparently they misinterpreted the engineering data in that report, because the walls for the levees, they suggested having pilings of 44 foot deep, and they only built them to 17 foot deep.
All right.
So obviously,
what was their reasoning for that, other than cost and laziness?
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
right? And so they saved $100 million. Big engineering mistakes do happen. Like cock-ups are made where people misinterpret data or read things wrong. You would be amazed how many disasters have happened from. We talked very briefly about the Challenger disaster, didn't we? In the or even the Columbia disaster in the first episode. I think in such a big organisation, when you're doing that type of planning, you just imagine somebody somewhere went, you do know that this isn't really good enough. This should be better. These should be almost twice as deep. This is where we tread on the more sort of politically explosive ground, I think, because there's an awful lot of commentary out there. It doesn't take much to find it on the internet, whereby they're protecting a majority black city, or African American city, and decision makers who are seen to be in the north, distant at the federal level,
right,
subject to all of the politics of the US more broadly. And there's this deep suspicion that cost saving, that penny pinching, that we've cocked it up but let's not say anything attitude was driven by like an institutional racism that, well, we can look down our nose at New Orleans because, well, we just don't take them seriously.
Yeah.
And I find that appalling. I know that we have problems, like every country has this, doesn't it, where the centre treats the provinces with a certain amount of disdain.
Yeah.
And certainly as two boys from the northeast of England.
We're from a wasteland. Yeah.
Well, William the Conqueror harried the north, and that's it. There's nothing left, right? Yeah. And then there's Hadrian's Wall in Scotland exists above us, which is fine. But the racial tone of this discussion and how quickly race enters that discussion leads me to suspect there might be something to it. From an outside point of view, I find that so unpleasant. That you would risk your spending decisions and the risks you take would be so much greater, and your spending would be so much less on the basis that they're a city of majority African Americans that we don't care about.
Yeah.
And I find that very, very alien. But it's not entirely out of the ordinary for infrastructure decisions in the States. There was a case I came across just on a little bit sort of side reading by building a metro line in one of the cities. And the reason why they decided not to build the metro line, despite the fact they're desperate for public transport, was because white residents of a neighbourhood didn't want black people passing through.
Right.
And this is quite recently in the 2000s.
Okay.
This is all couched in terms of we don't want poor people coming through here, through our wealthy neighbourhood.
Yeah.
This is the language.
Which is bad enough in itself.
Which is bad enough in itself, yeah. And I also agree, in Britain we have terrible infrastructure, but that's almost because of always penny pinching and just bad planning generally.
Yeah.
And people want infrastructure but aren't willing to pay for it. Right, fine, that's our affair. But again, I don't know if we have that sort of attitude, and our willingness or their willingness to, in those wealthy communities to use wealth and poor as a proxy, because everybody knows what it really means.
Yeah.
But you don't have to say it out loud.
Mm-hmm. You don't say it out loud.
Yeah.
At all.
Yeah, and it's so sad. I actually buy the analysis. I do buy the analysis that for like great structural reasons in the politics, this is why you get these terrible infrastructure decisions on building levees. They invest a certain amount, but it's not enough. It's really not enough. And then, as you see, you've got this process later on in the 90s where it starts to erode, and maybe they need to rethink and they need to, or reinvest at least.
Yeah, reinvest.
And they don't.
No.
One thing we haven't mentioned so far is the number of deaths. No. And on the lower bound of the estimates is 1,245, of which anywhere between 2/3 and 3/4 is caused by the flooding, and the rest is sort of more indirect deaths, like because of the wind and flying debris and motor accidents and so on. But just the flooding kills the majority of those folk. You can see why this is really very, very key to identity and politics down in Louisiana and the coastal areas. Let's not forget there was a lot of damage done in Mississippi and
Georgia,
all those coastal areas. Mississippi especially suffered terrible damage as well. But obviously the main damage was in the city itself.
Old news.
So the next point I wanted to move on to was a little bit about the evacuation, because you said something before about the evacuation of the city, didn't you? When they ordered the evacuation, it was unique.
Yeah, it was the first mandatory evacuation of the entire city, given that this city has been prone to flooding since its inception.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of people just don't get into the evacuation procedure properly. I've got a little bit here about the planning, and it was always sort of decided that the disaster planning was like a bottom-up process. So those local areas would have their own disaster planning for floods, and that if they needed help, they would then appeal upwards to the county level, and then if the county needed help, they would then appeal up to the state, and then the state, ultimately the federal authorities. And what was just badly exposed in this was that the local planning wasn't very good. Or maybe it was alright, but it was just such a severe incident that nobody had really thought about, that it was just overwhelmed. And so it took a huge amount of time for that upwards process to happen. And then you got this terrible delay and help coming, and you end up with the situation in the Superdome.
The Superdome.
The Superdome, yeah, where there's thousands of people sort of go there for protection, and it's not great, because that's one of the things that always baffled me in this. That I know you might want to go into a big building and feel safe with other folk, but a big building like that, with a big stadium with a roof over the top, it's just prone to wind damage. And that's exactly what happened, wasn't it? The membrane of the roof over it largely just peeled away. Mm-hmm. And you're left with this situation. I think that very sort of quickly leads into the way this was reported. And this is something I do remember from the incident. And you remember how salacious it was?
Oh, not really.
Well, so there was a lot of talk about looting and murder and rape and violence. And let's not pretend that those things don't exist and didn't exist in a city like New Orleans. Any city in the world, they have all those things. But there was a lot of salaciousness about it was out of control. A lot of the coverage, I remember it being very garish. Right?
Yeah, I suppose I can remember it kind of getting a bit almost excited by the fact that it was a bit Mad Maxian.
But I think,
if that's a word.
But I think what it is, what it is now. One of the things that I think, again, talking about the proxy of rich and poor for black and white in American politics or in American media, what I think was very clearly evident, and I think because this is going to be controversial, is how people were willing to believe that it had descended into this terrible Mad Max, everyone for himself wasteland, because the population was majority African American. Let's not forget that the neighbourhoods that were greatly affected is it the 9th department, the 9th district?
Yeah, or the 9th ward.
The 9th ward, that's right, the 9th ward, which is one of the poorest areas of town, overwhelmingly African American. And so these are the people that are affected the most. Again, the tone of the coverage just had this sort of terrible... They're behaving like animals, and they're very depersonalized. And I think it's very easy for a lot of media to depersonalize African American communities in particular. They're like in urban African American communities that are seen as just being other. They're a block. You just refer to them as a block the way I just did, in a way, not as individual people. There's a lot of the stereotypes came to the fore, because when it came to relief efforts, there was a lot of people very willing to sort of say, oh, well, these people are just sponging. They're lazy. They're not looking after themselves. Despite the fact these are really poor people from a desperately poor part of town, they've just had
everything
Armageddon
washed away.
Yeah, all of their homes, their livelihoods.
All their possessions.
And so you get this enormous number of people that are evacuated, and they end up elsewhere, don't they? In sort of cities like Houston.
That kept popping up, Houston, all over the place. Yeah.
And so you've got this enormous, it's something like 300,000 people that are evacuated out of the city.
I didn't find that figure, but that must be about right, because I did some maths on population.
They reckoned when they registered all of the refugees, there wasn't a single state in the US that didn't have a refugee.
Right.
Yeah, because presumably a lot of people went to the local areas where they had families, but people just ended up scattered to the four winds. Because in the end, if we look at the the population of the city after the event? How many have left?
I didn't note down what it was immediately after, but in 2006 the population was estimated at 255,000, which was 56% of the original population.
So just more than half of the population. I mean, that's going to be devastating to any economy. But people have gradually started to return.
Been returning. By 2010, the areas that hadn't been flooded or not severely affected were back to 100% of their original population, or higher.
Yeah. And they were all like the older parts of the city, weren't they? Presumably the higher ground.
The higher ground that hadn't been drained, yep. Yeah. And by 2015, the population was back at 389,617, to be precise. And that was where I had to do the maths to come up with the percentage, is give or take about 86% of the original population.
Right, so you've still got 14% of the population is now forming this diaspora that exists elsewhere.
And now I would suggest probably aren't ever coming back. The city might, I'm sure the city will eventually get back on a par and then increase in size, but it's not going to be the people who left coming back.
And one thing that's really interesting, just to kind of follow the theme that we've been talking about, is the differential rates of return between white communities and African American communities. In that the poorer, generally speaking, poorer African American communities have returned at a much lower rate than the white communities, who are presumably people who have a little bit of wealth behind them, I suppose.
There's also been a reluctance to rebuild the poorer parts of the city. They're using this opportunity, you might say, to replan the city, and they're involving the population of the city in, what do you think we should do, rebuilding it. But of course that means the more wealthy people get more of a say, and it's gentrification writ large by the sounds of things.
Scale, So one of the things that isn't being replaced is a lot of the public and social housing. Which obviously tends to be the poorer communities. You think that replanning the city would be your opportunity to then maybe think about, well, do we want communities with a better social mix?
How do we integrate the communities? How do we... exactly. What a brilliant opportunity this is. Let's start with a clean slate. Let's mix everyone together.
I suppose because the rate of return of folk has this racial bias to it, it then allows structural racism to sort of come in, because all the decisions just get made by, as you say, by the people with the loudest voice. One of the things I read was a Guardian article where from I think it was 2008, and they were talking about the Disneyfication of New Orleans. Because New Orleans is very, very famous for obviously its culture, right? So,
the Mardi Gras and the Jazz and Heritage Festival,
and they were never
cancelled, which is amazing. The timing of them changed, so in 2005 they were put back, I assume. I didn't look up when they actually were, but one assumes they were put back in the year, but they weren't actually cancelled,
which says something about the vital cultural identity of the city, and because of that, tourism is a big industry, and so the reconstruction is seen as a chance to bring in tourism. Well, again, that's another industry that is, it's very valuable for a lot of cities around the world, but it does tend to push locals out. And I suppose if your locals are living in Houston or in the surrounding states and have been there for a number of years, then, well, when you're building to incorporate a bigger tourist industry, it's your opportunity to exclude people so they can't come back.
Old news.
One of the things that's interesting is that there's been a huge amount of squabbling over who funds this. We mentioned this at the top of the show, didn't we?
Did we?
Well, we did. Well, very briefly. But there is a bit under the George W. Bush administration where they're talking about getting funds from the federal government to help reconstruction and repairs. And it's all sort of delayed and, gets bogged down in the Congress and whatever. What they want to do is pass a war funding bill, which is quicker because you can expedite spending decisions through war funding. So, again, one of these sort of arcane bits of American kind of procedural bits in the Congress. I assume that because they've got things going on in Iraq and whatever, that they're having to appropriate money to fund that so you can tack stuff onto the bottom of it.
Right.
as line items. But the George W. Bush administration kind of goes, well, no, not yet. Oh, we need to think about this carefully. They do actually do the spending, but it's done through the next year's budget. So again, there's this inordinate sort of delay in spending. Again, there's a lot of people out there kind of saying, well, why the delay here? Because they're not electorally important.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. They're not going to vote in a way that's friendly to the
Republican Party.
Yeah.
That whole thing just seemed really, really strange to me when I was looking into it. The thing that came to my mind is what would happen in this country. We never really get events of this scale. I was trying to think of an event of anything near
Sheffield
this
in 2000? No, the floods in 2000?
What I thought might be the nearest...
I can't remember now. No, Sheffield was late.
I was thinking that the nearest equivalent might be the floods in York.
Oh, right.
Because,
okay, yeah.
well, because it's a sort of similar... Obviously nowhere near the scale, but York is a small city... like from our country's political perspective, north of London, so therefore considered less important,
yeah.
but of quite large cultural importance.
Yeah, of historical value.
Yeah. So what I tried to look into was, so who paid for the damage in York? It was mostly private insurance companies.
That's right.
When you come down to it.
Yeah.
But the government, mostly through local government, paid people, just gave them grants to rebuild their lives, rebuild their houses, rebuild their businesses. Just no question about it. This is a thing that we'll do. I mean, there will have been discussion about it, and people will have had to have applied for it and things like that. But I just can't imagine the same sort of wrangling
and dithering
about giving some people in a city some money to rebuild their lives after a disastrous event.
There is mechanisms inside the EU, isn't there, whereby member states do get wedges of money in the event of disasters. Now, sure, we did get them in the 2000 floods.
Right.
Similarly, when there was the Italian earthquake a few years ago, and there's like a pot of emergency money that can be called upon, for relief efforts. Or just about relief efforts, like the Byzantine nature of American politics, right? Did you hear about the UK's contribution to relief efforts?
No.
Right? So we sent 350,000 emergency meal packs that were eventually never delivered because of restrictions on the importation of British beef because of BSE, mad cow.
Really? Which had disappeared years before.
And that's something which has always irritated me on that whole thing, because bashing British beef imports, right? And I can't say I'm a huge advocate for British agricultural produce here, right? This is...
Buy British lamb. Buy British lamb.
Oh dear. That is entirely about the American beef lobby just wanting to exclude a competitor. That's all it is, right? And so the American public, for years and years and years, even long since after the event, were convinced that BSE was still a problem and all of our beef was still poisonous. What is essentially something to do with internal US politics, like in terms of the agricultural American lobby, that they turned down all this free food and our efforts are wasted. To me, that's just appalling.
Yeah. Well, did you read about the trailers? That FEMA,
the Federal Emergency Management Agency trailers.
Yeah. About how many of those were just uninhabitable or sort of semi-habitable. You went for months without any electricity or water supply.
Yeah. So they have these like emergency caravan type things that people are supposed to be housed in, and it's just
left empty.
Yeah.
Huge numbers of them, thousands of them.
What a waste, yeah.
Yeah.
So interestingly, just on the kind of talk about our point of view, Cuba and Venezuela, Venezuela's under Chavez at the time, they offer aid. They offer medical aid, medicines, and so on, and the Americans turn it down.
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know if surely that's just pride.
Well, how
Isn't
much
that
of it
pride?
is it's this terrible Realpolitik, isn't it? But if we accept your aid, you're just going to then make a propaganda victory against us. I would say take the propaganda hit and use it to build bridges.
Yeah.
Again, if somebody offered me 200 tons of medical supplies, whatever it was a substantial amount. It was tons and tons and tons of medical supplies and medical personnel they were offering. Take them, and be magnanimous.
Yeah.
Then say, what a great victory for friendship,
humanity,
bridge building. If you want there's always a friend in the United States. You only have to. It becomes your propaganda victory if you want it to be.
Yeah.
But instead, it was this very churlish is the word, isn't it?
I was thinking childish. Well, you know what came to mind while you were talking about it is Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey hate each other as nations.
But in the Turkish earthquake, right?
Who were the first people in there helping? It was the Greeks.
Yeah.
The Greek government.
Well,
and
no,
Greek people.
Wasn't. It was Greek volunteers first, and then after a few days, the Greek government was shamed into it. But in fairness, yes, it was the Greeks.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was seen to be extremely productive in terms of building bridges and relieving tensions and so on. Yeah, it's just so sad. One of the things I find weird as well is there are many rich countries that provide assistance. Norway, France and Israel are initially turned down, but then are asked to help anyway at a later date. It just seems strange that you would turn down international aid offered from allies as well, and then subsequently, cap in hand, go, oh, sorry, could you please do that? I mean, obviously, it must be incredibly difficult to coordinate all these things, because you'd have aircraft landing. Canada provided a substantial amount of aid, so you'd have the Canadian Air Force show up with God knows how many tons of material and people, and
in all their one aeroplanes.
That's right. So patronising.
Sorry, Canada, I know you have 3 airplanes.
Yes, that's right.
Almost 3.
Almost 3. Oh dear. Oh dear.
But you know what? We love Canada.
We do love Canada. We love Canada a lot. Yeah.
They're just easy targets.
Yeah, that's true.
Like New Zealand.
Yeah, we'll insult them, and New Zealand provided aid as well.
Right.
Yeah, interestingly, so did Norway and India as well. And interesting, a country with.
Well, they don't have a problem supplying beef, do they?
Oh dear, they have distinctly BSC-free beef.
Yeah.
In that they don't have any beef.
Well, I have tons of beef. They're just not allowed to do anything with it. It's all walking the streets.
Yeah, he's been preaching on my high horse about racism for the whole of the for the whole of the podcast. Oh dear. So I think it's just curious that a nation that has its own challenges in its own backyards also felt the urge to offer substantial amounts of money. Although the biggest donors, guess who the biggest donors were?
Mexico?
The Arabs.
Oh, right.
Right, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So interesting that I suppose they're all kind of, the America's backyard in the Middle East in a way. They're all friendly nations. But it's interesting, I think it's very easy to point the finger at those countries and go, oh, they're undemocratic, terrible, whatever. But I don't know, I think there are people in those governments that take their commitment to humanitarianism very seriously, and although they don't necessarily have the skills to export, to send men and material, they certainly
have money,
but they certainly have cash, and they're willing to spend cash. So much as I might be critic of a lot of the governments in that part of the world, fair play to them.
Old news.
It's interesting. I think this incident in 2005 and the various flooding incidents we have in Europe. In the UK, we the sort of the 2000s are very, very sort of notable, aren't they, for the sort of various flooding events we have sort of from 2000 onward, and how the thinking really changes. In the UK, certainly, we've started to talk about, well, let's reinstate wetlands on the coastal areas. Mm-hmm. Well, because it's great for wildlife and the rest, but also it acts as that sponge, that sort of protected area.
It's like a buffer zone between the water and the people.
Yeah, and let nature take what it needs in order to act as a barrier.
Yeah.
I can see why, from a cultural, it's a very valuable cultural asset in New Orleans for the States. I just fear that although they have tried to incorporate some of that, the solution in the end is just more engineering, bigger levees,
more man against nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just wonder whether this is just going to get worse because of
climate change.
Climate change.
Yeah.
It's amazing, reading a little bit about like the natural impact, if that's the word, in New Orleans. The lands that were lost, just permanently put underwater, never to be reclaimed again. Islands there was a whole chain of islands off the coast. Like half of those islands disappear. Breeding grounds for valuable species, sea turtles and whatever. They all washed away or ended up in sort of permanently underwater.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you might say that's maybe like natural process.
Yeah, because that would have happened. Those islands would have disappeared whether mankind was around or not. I suppose the difference there is the turtles. If mankind wasn't around, the turtles would have just found somewhere else. Because we're here, the turtles might not be able to find somewhere else.
That's true. Yeah.
They probably have, but there's that chance. There's probably more of them died than necessarily should have.
It's old news!
So, what lessons do we learn from the whole show?
Spend money on your dikes.
Spend money on dikes. Maybe we should employ a whole army of small Dutch boys to go around putting fingers in things. What I take away from this is the almighty power of nature, and how, despite our best efforts, sometimes it will just bite us in the bum. It frightens me in a way, but it also gives me... I just hope that we learn from this type of incident. We learn to live with nature a little bit better. Just as a little aside of this, and there was a little news story which came out a little while ago, I noticed that this is Katrina, which is a female name, and Rita is also a female name. And there's a really interesting piece of research that came out last year about the number of deaths compared to hurricanes with male names and hurricanes with female names.
Right.
Because the practice is at the start of the season you start with the letter A, and you go A, B, C, C, D, and you alternate male and female.
Yeah.
It can be statistically shown that more people are killed by female hurricanes.
Okay.
And they reckon this is because people don't take the threat seriously enough from a female name.
Really?
Yeah. It's essentially a sexist response to her hurricanes. Right? Because I was talking about this to a work colleague, right? And he was very angry at me, going, "Oh well, if you measure A or B will always be greater than one or the other." I said, no. Like, if you read the actual news report, this is statistically significant. This is not just chance.
Right.
And it just baffles me that sexism is so ingrained in society that, Hurricane Charles...
We're safer,
Yeah. Like, the utilitarian thing to do would just be to have all male names.
Yeah.
Or just give abstract names, I suppose. Hurricane 1, Hurricane 2.
Yeah.
I don't know if authority comes and says, you need to get out of your house because there's going to be a disaster. Like, any minute now.
What's the disaster called? Oh, well, that wears a dress. Okay, that's
all right.
That's not so bad.
Yeah. I'll just have a cup of tea.
Yeah.
It's just madness. Well, I think that covers what we wanted to say.
It does, yeah.
One incident, but it brings out so many issues about society and politics and nature and how we live. I think it's been really interesting.
Yeah.
So, as is traditional at this point of proceedings, we'd like to thank Mr. Peter Kitson for the use of his voice.
And to bensound.com for the use of their royalty-free music.
And of course, you can get in touch with us at our website, oldnews.podbean.com.
You can email us at oldnewspod@gmail.com.
Find us on Facebook, just search for Old News Podcast.
Or you can tweet us at oldnewspod. We've done that thing where we've got YouTube.
Oh, yes.
Search for us on YouTube.
You can definitely find us on YouTube if you use a magnifying glass and some...
some tweeters.
and some cunning...
Just some cunning.
Yes, some cunning. Cunning internet foo. Right, so on that note, I think we should say goodbye.
Yeah, thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
something else I wanted to say as well. Oh, yes. Please like and share us and give us 5 stars on iTunes.
Yeah. And on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got our first YouTube comment.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite possibly a spam.
It almost certainly was spam.
That's right. I actually engaged with a piece of spam on Facebook today.
All right.
There was an advert for somebody who there was a photograph of a candle, and there was like a bloke, like say, such and such bloke's book is about to be published. Please contact. Right. I could resist commenting that this looked like cult advertising. When you see an advert that's just empty of contact or content,
right.
and then please get in touch, and you think, this just looks a bit sus. So anyway, the chap whose book it was like got sort of messaged me back and went, "This is the first. I really hadn't thought that it would look like that." And I said, "Well," he said, "Well, like why do you think it looks like this?" And I said, "Well, because you've got the religious overtones with the candle, and that sort of empty advertising kind of looks a bit like what the Scientologists do, and get people in." And do you know what this guy does as a living? He does advertising.
All right, and he hadn't thought of that at all.
No. How embarrassing.
Yeah. He'll have thought, well, that's mysterious. That'll get people in.
Yeah. And apparently he's one of these guys. He's written the book, presumably it's a business management book or whatever. Fine, good luck to him. But there's a chapter in there about how in the days of candlelight, people could only do like a certain amount of work in a certain amount of time, and how that changed once electric light came in. And so presumably that's quite an interesting sort of point he's making.
Right.
But he does really misjudge the advert. Or at least everybody who looks at that advert now thinks it's misjudged because I'm the first comment.
He's going to run all these advertising past you now. You're going to get messages from
I'm clearly in the wrong profession. So the linguistic obsessives at the Last Tuesday project are really desperate for us to do an advert for Babe Station, but I'm not going to do an advert for Babe Station.
This isn't an advert for Babe Station.
I greatly disapprove of Babe Station, but
I don't disapprove of Babe Station.
Oh really? I disapprove of Babe Station.
Do you?
We don't disapprove of Babe Station.
No, I don't know why. Boobs.
Oh God!
Sorry.
No. Yeah, get rid of that.